Welcome to Signal Fire.
Since 2005, the United States has lost more than 3,500 local newspapers, about 2 a week, every week for 20 years. 270,000 jobs gone. Today, 50 million Americans live in counties with little or no local coverage. Nobody watching the city council, nobody covering the school board, nobody asking why the water smells different than it used to. And this goes deeper than civics. Humans don't make sense of the world through facts. We make sense of it through stories. Who we are, what our community is doing, what's worth fighting for. It's not a weakness, it's how meaning gets made for human beings. But it means that whoever controls the stories controls me and you. In thousands of American communities, the people who know what is actually happening, the real places and real things, those people have gone. And what moves in isn't silence. It's big media and social media blasting from Washington and New York, telling you immigrants are the reason your kids aren't thriving, that your life feels out of control because of people you've never met. The country those papers used to cover is more resilient, more kind, more functional, more willing to work across lines than any of that suggests. But it has almost no one left to tell its real story anymore. What does journalism have to become to give that country back its voice?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Signal Fire. I'm Lisa Senecal, and I am here with podcast co-host John Ziegler. John, great to see you.
Good to see you as well.
And it's also pretty amazing to see James Fallows here with us. It is such a privilege to welcome you as our guest today. James, for those who don't know you or have only discovered you recently, I'm going to give an abbreviated version of your bio. Jim is an award-winning book and magazine writer with 12 books and hundreds of magazine articles for The Atlantic and many others to his credit. He won the National Book Award for his book National Defense and has also won the National Magazine Award. In his 20s, he was chief White House speechwriter for President Jimmy Carter. Jim has written from and lived and been a visiting professor at colleges and universities around the world. He's a longtime instrument-rated pilot, and he and his brilliant wife and linguistics expert, Deborah, traveled for years by propeller plane around the country in reporting for Our Towns, a book that everyone should read, which is also made into an HBO documentary that everybody should watch. Jim continues to write for The Atlantic and now also authors the Substack newsletter Breaking the News. Yes, that is the short version of Jim's bio. So, Jim, thank you so much for being here.
Lisa and John, it's a real pleasure to join you, and thanks for having me.
We just finished reading your piece, Jim, on the State of the Union that everybody should definitely read. And like you, it took me 2 days to be able to finish listening / watching the entire spectacle, abomination, whatever term you want to use for whatever that was. Can you give us some of your top impressions of what we saw Tuesday night?
So something that the young people of this era may not realize is that State of the Unions used to be sort of contained events. You mentioned I worked for Jimmy Carter. When I was doing that, I worked on several of his State of the Unions. And from an unbroken string from Richard Nixon through the first George Bush, before Bill Clinton, State of the Unions were typically about half an hour long. I think that Nixon gave one that was like in the 22-minute range, and Carter did a couple that were 31 minutes. So these used to be meant as sort of ways to hold the nation's attention because they are surprisingly the biggest audience a president ever attracts. Each year there are bigger audiences than inaugural addresses. And they had been meant in previous times to be inclusive, a way for a president to reach people who weren't already on his team, to talk about things that we Americans might aspire to together. I mentioned Bill Clinton, and there is context here. Bill Clinton gave the first more than hour-long State of the Union speech. And this was surprising because it was mocked by commentators at the time. But then as the ratings came in a day or two later, they found that the longer the speech went on, the more the audience grew because people actually liked Clinton's explaining details. Donald Trump has taken that both to an extreme and then the opposite direction. His speech a couple days ago, as we are talking, was almost 2 hours long, which is just inconceivable in previous terms. And also, I am sure if it's like the one he gave last year, the audience would be sinking with every sort of 5 minutes that it went on, just because it droned on, and it was addressed to no one except his base. That if you were looking for something that would be red meat for people who liked the immigration raids that are going on now, or who liked tariffs, or who liked combativeness with our neighbors and with NATO allies, then you got more of what you were looking for. And if you were not liking that, you didn't hear anything that would either hold your attention as a performance or attract you as a potential voter. So I thought this was probably by the time this podcast airs, there'll be other emergencies we're dealing with. But I think historians might look on this as an episode of how servile the Republican Party was in getting up a record number of times, practically every sentence, with this applause led by smiling Vance and Johnson. So it was quite an experience, one that will be studied in perverse and sort of pre-stage of disease contexts as opposed to the ones that are remembered.
Yeah, it has this quality of a speech to the Comintern or something, right? Where it is a sort of performative display. There's a quality of almost grotesqueness of the rhetoric, right? And which is really the opposite of the kinds of rhetoric we often hear in these things. I wonder why. Is that just Trump's weird psychology? Does it work in some way? Like, why? I'm curious why you think that is.
So that is. I wish I had an authoritative and all-encompassing answer to that. What struck me in this speech is that you could see like a really not so much a patchwork quilt, but more like a sort of a mannequin with a leg grafted onto its forehead or something like that. There were parts of it that just didn't fit together. So there was part of the speech that was, quote, written, unquote, like the beginning, the first paragraph or two, and the sort of maudlin last two paragraphs of "we aspire to great things," blah, blah, blah. You could see that those had been cranked out by some junior high school level speechwriter, and that Trump was struggling with them. There's almost, this is the part I have to read. So that was done sort of by rote, and it was not offensive, but it just was sort of mediocre. Then there was a part that was like a Trump rally speech. Greatest economy the world has ever seen. All our problems are from Joe Biden. Democrats are so terrible, et cetera. And then there was this other part that creeps into Trump's rally speeches, but seemed to be at its highlight here. And it was in what is known in the speechwriting trade as the Lenny Skutnik moments. Ronald Reagan, back in one of his, I guess, in 1982 speech, I believe, there had been this terrible airplane crash in Potomac. Just before that, a young man working, I think, for the Congressional Budget Office named Lenny Skutnik had bravely dived into the frozen river. He saved somebody. And so Ronald Reagan was the first person to call out somebody in the First Lady's box and say, here is somebody who represents what's great in America. The way that this has morphed into bad forms over the years, but Trump made it mainly about people who he could present as victims of evildoers, mainly illegal immigrants. And he seemed to relish in, that this young woman in Charlotte was stabbed repeated times, and her mother was there in the audience, and other people who were, blood was rolling down the aisles of the helicopter, and just was. I mentioned in this piece that if you were a high school counselor and there was some 14-year-old boy who was talking this way, you would be paying attention because it just is not normal. I mean, in normal discourse, it's not normal. And for a speech to 30 or 40 million people, it is weird. So we had the stuff he had to read obligatorily, we had the rally speeches, and then we had this super creepy stuff, which Rachel Maddow called violence porn. I don't know of a better term for it, but it struck me as there was more of it than usual, and that was bad.
That old quality of what we thought of as presidential speeches, particularly presidential high point speeches. For me, the one that sticks in my mind is Reagan after the Challenger disaster, right? That kind of quality of almost poetic, but a kind of elevation, an expression of a national sentiment, a kind of aspiring to a thing which to unity and to hope and to all of that kind of stuff. And it, obviously, sometimes we know State of the Unions can be very laundry listy, right? Bill Clinton, but there's usually some of that language. I wonder who you see today. Like, is that a lost art because people's consumption of media has changed so much, their tastes have changed so much, or is it the case that there are people, I think of someone maybe like a James Tallarico right now, who I think is appealing to that. Is that a thing that can be recaptured, and do you see anyone doing it well?
So that is a great question. Just to give a little bit of more context, there are, again, these sort of three baskets of presidential speeches. There are inaugural addresses that have most of the lines we remember. Ask not what your country can do for you. The only thing we have to fear, things of that sort. So there's inaugural addresses. There are these State of the Unions, which are usually not memorable for lines, but for ideas they try to get across. And then there are these times when the president is there as, I'll use the gender term, as the father of the nation, the person who is dealing with a nation in crisis, and eventually the mother of the nation, but person who is the head of the family, the head of the national family, and the head of the international family. And I was thinking of, again, for Jimmy Carter, one time he was called upon to do that was after a disaster. When there was a rescue mission to try to get Iranian hostages, and it failed, and he came on to say he was taking responsibility for this. The decision was his, the fault was his, and he was owning that. Bill Clinton, not in the immediate aftermath, but after the bombing in Oklahoma City, he was having a testimony of all that. I think Barack Obama, the time when he did this most movingly, was in Charleston, South Carolina, after the horrible gun massacre, racist gun massacre there at the Mother Emanuel Church, when he ended up singing Amazing Grace at the end of this. And George W. Bush, whom I will always fault for having started the Iraq War, 2 times after the 9/11 attacks, which he said led to the Iraq War, both when he went to the rubble in New York City, and then about 10 days after the attacks, when he addressed a joint session of Congress. In both of those times, he was at his best, talking to a national family and international family. So this is an art that has been there. I think the people I think of most clearly now are the state and local officials rising to the emergencies being inflicted upon them. I think the governors of Illinois and of Minnesota and of California have notably stepped up. I'm thinking of J.B. Pritzker saying that if you hurt my people, you're going to have to come through me, and I'm not going to forget. And Tim Walz and Jacob Fry, I believe his name is, the mayor of Minnesota, and the other Minnesota officials talking about what their communities were going through. And Gavin Newsom, I believe, during the Los Angeles ICE crackdowns there, saying we are standing up. It has been the crises that have been inflicted upon us mainly are self-inflicted by our national government. So I think most mayors and most governors who've come under this stress are giving us examples of brave and forthright rhetoric of trying to heal a community, find its commonalities, and recognize what it needs to stand up for and how bravely it is standing up. So those are the people I'm looking at now.
I was reading a little bit earlier today about this outside group or groups or individuals. It's very hard to figure out who it is outside the White House who is talking to the White House about pushing Trump to declare a state of emergency so that the midterm elections, he can have a frightening amount of control over them if the courts were not able to intervene in time. The way last Tuesday's speech really was speaking just to his base. Do you think that that is because Trump is just incapable of not speaking to only his base and he just truly does not care about the other 2/3 of the country and what the country thinks? Or do you think his lack of interest in trying to pull other people into the fold is because he really does aspire to be able to Bigfoot the elections?
This is another fascinating question to which wish I had a more knowledgeable answer. Of course, we all operate in the realm of the unknown when it comes to Trump. It's interesting that Trump seems incapable. It's more difficult for him to be hostile to people to their face than it is in the abstract. So at his rallies, he can rant about these terrible Democrats, and he could call the mayor of New York a communist. But apparently, Mamdani charmed him in the Oval Office. And when Trump was coming in to the Capitol for his latest State of the Union address, he went out of his way to shake the hands of the only 4 Supreme Court justices who had the guts to show up for the event, including the 2 that had voted against it. Was it 2 or 3? So Roberts and Barrett, he showed, they voted against him, and he shook their hands. So I think he has more of a sort of pleaser personality in person. Then he's found. So I will have a 3-layer cake here again. that he shies from dissing people in person. Then he has the sort of carnival barker's skill or professional wrestler's skill of reading the crowd. And he seems to be hyper wired for when they're getting bored and what is getting their attention. And he's learned that at his rallies over the last 10 years now, he gets attention, and the crowd went by attack and by hostility, and sort of the kind of, he knows the greatest hits lines, which he uses over and over again. And by chance, I know Don Henley of Eagles Group, and so I've had that little window in the rock and roll world, and sort of the tedium of being called on for your greatest hits, because that's what they're waiting for. And so he knows the greatest hits are going to get the crowd going. And then he has these formal orations where he can't read the crowd, because most of the audience is seeing it on TV, and the people in front of him increasingly act like trained SEALs, and they just jump up and down, and so he can't tell how it's working. And so I think that, and also level 3.5 or 4, he's now surrounded by people who shield him from reality. The first time he had Mattis, and he had McMaster, and he had other people who now look like sort of, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in retrospect, who would give him some sense of, you're going too far, you shouldn't say this. Now it's the likes of Levitt and Miller and these other people. And so I think he has no break on the attack mode. So he can't read the crowd. Nobody around him is saying, you're going too far. And he doesn't like the idea that if they show him polls that are going down, he has to say, well, this is a big lie. So I think it's a descending or intensifying spiral of bringing out the worst of him and the least bridge building part of him.
You wrote a book almost 30 years ago, Breaking the News in 1997. And in that you said, and I'll just quote a little bit here, the press could, should, and must do a better job in giving readers an honest and a realistic and honest view of the world. Otherwise, the public, and the quote there, but say the press would suffer, and the public would find it harder to understand the world as it really is. And looking back at that analysis, which to me seems quite prescient, are we where you feared we would be? Are we worse in some ways? I'm curious how you assess your own analysis from this perspective.
We were all so much younger then. This book came out. This book came out when Fox News was in its first months of existence, and when the idea of sort of tailored partisan news was just sort of a gleam in Roger Ailes' eye. And I think he actually worked for MSNBC back then, Roger Ailes. And he was sort of went from MSNBC to Fox. And I was trying to imagine a world in which people still recognized a distinction between public information and entertainment. And that if you tried to judge things just on entertainment criteria, what was entertaining would always win, because that was its reason for being. And that education and religion and research and public information always had some other thing than simply being entertaining. You wanted to make it as interesting as it could be, but also judge it on its importance. And I think the struggle since then has been on two fronts. One is the rapidly shifting economic foundation of the whole information business that you're well aware of, and the local newspapers have suffered most quickly and are now trying to find ways to reinvent themselves. But all media have had to contend with an entirely different environment. So there's the economic change, and then there's sort of the entire extinction of the idea that information is any different from entertainment, and that clicks and hits and all the rest are what you should be getting. And I think there are different parts of it's a moment to dip into the realm of cliche inspired by this latest speech. It's the best of times and the worst of times. It's the worst of times for the model of local media, as we know. And for say, the Washington Post regional newspapers have been in terrible trouble, mainly for reasons of business models and their ownership. But it is the best of times in the realm of experimentation, as you all know firsthand. And across the country, there are 100 different models of local news, which is still vital. And I think the New York Times and Wall Street Journal are particularly important crucibles for ways they're trying to reinvent themselves. As a side note, the Times is sometimes dissed for having so much of its business be recipes and the wire cutter and puzzles and all that with a newspaper attached. That's what newspapers have always been. When I was a kid getting the Los Angeles Times, like 900 pages thick each day, those 900 pages were mainly real estate ads and used car ads and all the rest, and the news was subsidized by that. So it's a time of trying to reinvent a business basis for the information that people need and upon which democracy depends. That's my homily, but I should ask you your respective homilies, because you're in the middle of this reinvention too. What should I tell my friends about the most exciting part of your reinvention? I'm turning the tables on you for a moment.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Well, no, we appreciate that. We don't get to talk about what we're doing very often, and we do think it's exciting. So Noodle, the application that we're building, we hope, believe that is going to be a platform that enables creators and journalists to be able to report the news in short form video format, most of all with far greater speed than people are able to do it right now, and with real fidelity to evidence and truth and facts. I'm curious, we've talked about this before, Jim, that there is now a need for journalists to also be video personalities, creators, and to help promote the written work that they're doing through short form video. So obviously we've been spending a lot of time thinking about that as we've been creating this platform. When you think about that role and embracing that, and what the Atlantic, who you write for, and other publications are going to need to do you see that as being a piece that journalists are ready to take on and feel they can have a real impact in getting more people to read the work that they're doing?
I think this is a natural, welcome, and much needed next stage evolution in how people in our craft have done their work. And just to, I was not around at the time of the Civil War, although the Atlantic was around at that time. But then the innovation was sending photographers like Matthew Brady and illustrators along with people who were doing these reports from the battlefield. And the Atlantic and Harper's, which existed in a different form at that time, would have, they would have these illustrations mainly and eventually photos. It was hard for magazines and newspapers to present photos then. When I was starting out as a reporter, I was one of my early jobs was as sort of a newsboy for the Los Angeles Times. I worked for a civil rights newspaper in Alabama called the Southern Courier in the late 1960s. And I would be sent around with a notepad like the one I'm holding up here and a camera and also a little tape recorder. And my job was to take down notes and to interview people and to use photographs that would be in this printed newspaper all together. As time went on over the last 20 years or so, reporters have been, and as the internet came into existence, reporters got more used to recording their own audio on scene and taking their own pictures on scene. And that just became part of what you did. And then the natural evolution, which smartphones have enabled, is taking actual video too. I personally, I enjoy taking photos and using them in what I write. I enjoy using audio clips that I've made. I don't personally enjoy taking videos with a smartphone, but people who are generations earlier in this career than I, that's a natural part of their toolkit, as the camera was for me when I was doing reporting in Alabama and Mississippi, and as tape recorders were back in those days. So I think it is a good thing to do. And think how the history of the past 3 or 4 months as we speak would have been different if there were not both citizen videographers and citizen journalist videographers,
Absolutely.
especially in Minnesota, giving us, but also in Chicago, also in California, showing us the truth of what happened. So it's easier to lie in certain ways with AI, but it is easier to debunk lies now that you have this reserve army of professionals and amateurs and volunteers saying, here is video evidence of what actually happened.
The Alex Preddy shooting, sits along sort of the great milestones of citizen journalism, right? And it is clear that without those multiple angles, that event does not happen. It's not understood in that way, and it doesn't have a kind of breakthrough. So I think that's right. It's a really powerful thing. At the same time, the Washington Post, your hometown paper, has gotten rid of, I think, their entire. A lot of their international staff. I don't know if it's. I know they no longer have any reporters. I think in Ukraine and in a number of other important places, right? So you have this kind of hollowing out of coverage that at one time was, if there was a reported story from the Washington Post coming out of Ukraine, it likely had at least one, but often several reporters there as part of an international bureau that were part of that. Those reporters didn't have to be famous. They didn't have to be good on camera. There would be names that you just, if you didn't know who they were, your eyes would just kind of roll over them. Right. And when we lose that kind of professional core of journalists reporting, from places around the world, reporting on beats that are a little deeper, right? So where you have to really be a subject matter expert to be able to. I wonder if you see a world where, and I'll say we in some sense we in what we're doing with Noodle are kind of banking on that world, right?
Yes.
But I wonder how you see a world where amateurs are doing that work and have, frankly, just a very different set of incentives. Because they're not just collecting a paycheck every week, right? They got to get the clicks, they got to get the views. They still are responding to that world. And I'd be curious, as somebody who's written for, edited, led journalistic publications for years. How do you see that incentive change? Where it's not I just want to keep a good job at a good paper. It's I got to get clicks. I got to build up a personal brand.
John, here are a couple of illustrations of the way these citizen videographers have made a difference. Rachel Maddow has made it a practice on each Monday show to have a roundup from around the country of people who are standing up for protests. And she may have films from 100 different cities, from Boise, Idaho, and from Waco, Texas, from all sorts. And these are all people, citizens who are there recording what's happening. And the power of that is much different with having all these little video clips than if she just was reading off the list of names. Also, I'm thinking back to the maybe 15 years ago when Deb and I were living in China during the time of the Arab Spring. I think that was the first time when sort of Twitter-based citizen reporting was having a big effect on world appreciation of what was happening in that part of the world. We felt it in China because the Chinese government was so afraid of that happening in China that they radically cracked down on the internet there. Even using cell phones became more difficult in China in that time. We'll come back, if you want, to the Washington Post as a standalone disaster. But we can take that as a standalone disaster, which stands for its own problems and the evils of Jeff Bezos, but also for the erosion of a situation where, say, 50 years ago, the Boston Globe might have had 40 reporters around the world. The Los Angeles Times had 50. And now there's just, skeleton crews for any place except a handful of big news organizations. So the need for this information continues if for no other reason than for businesses to be aware of what's going to happen, for national governments to know what's going on. So I think the forces of arbitrage will figure out some way for the people who can create this information and capture it, like this sort of reserve army of people who are not working for the New York Times, or not working for the old Time or Newsweek, which basically no longer exist, but are there, have the tools, can capture information that matters to get some kind of compensation for what they're doing. So that will have to happen, I pray, and I hope that people like you all can figure out the way to make it happen.
There is great frustration that I know the three of us share. It's not even so much the both sidesing. It's what John was describing before. It's just these completely bland, really truth extracted by trying not to seem partisan headlines, leads in these stories that are being written. And to my mind, they do incredible damage. We were talking about creators and independent journalists. They have different motivations. And one of them is that a lot of these people got involved in what they're doing because they feel really passionately about the issue that they're covering most closely. So having that distance, being an impartial observer and just reporting the facts is not something that we see as often from independent creators. But I think we see it to a fault now in a lot of legacy media organizations. So I guess I'm wondering where do you see that going? Is it an important balance that's happening? Are we losing something by not having that impartiality? Because to me, it feels as though being impartial right now, not calling things what they are when they're happening, is actually you're actually helping one side. Because if one side is lying and you're not willing to say that, then it's an assist to the liars.
Exactly. And this is the classic difference between objectivity, which is an unattainable thing, and being fair and being realistic and telling, how things are going on. And I think of different categories of this right now within the American media, within the general background that the world, the mainstream, the largest news organizations were set up to operate within no longer exists. And I'll illustrate that with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon famously is the only president so far who has had to resign. Richard Nixon got in trouble in large part for lying. But Richard Nixon seemed to lie only when he had to, only when it paid off to lie. And he didn't just lie. And there was some sense of shame and culpability when he was caught lying. We're now in a world where the White House press secretary just simply lies about everything. And Kristi Noem just lies, and Trump himself and Vance and the others just lie. And so newspapers that are used to reporting something where there's this kind of built-in equilibrium, if they're there to quote both sides, they are doing a disservice to their readers and to reality. And when I mentioned different tiers, I think you see National Public Radio fearful of public funding really knuckling under. And they are a really sad test case, I think, of having both sides in politics. You don't see that on the Marketplace program, which is run not by NPR, but by American Public Radio. You don't see it as much on PBS. I think the PBS NewsHour has been comparatively brave in calling things as they are, even though they have, the panels of bringing on people from both sides. The Wall Street Journal, interestingly, has a tradition of its news operations being independent of its Rupert Murdoch run editorial page. And so it's, even though the editorial page is on the anti-Trump side of tariffs, and its news operation has been fairly blunt about things and unafraid. The crucible right now, the Battle of Gettysburg, metaphorically, is the New York Times politics coverage. And I think there is a fascinating, why does this matter? Most people in the U.S. don't read the New York Times, but most journalists in the U.S. are affected by it. It's still, in the days when evening news on TV mattered, you could look at the front page of the New York Times that morning and tell what was going to be on the evening news show. And it still has this enormous steering current function. It still has a more robust reporting staff around the world than anybody else. It still does better work at its best than anybody else does. But it has so ingrained with the sort of whipped horse, beaten dog metaphor of not wanting to be criticized from the right. That's been a caricature of critics say that Trump is lying about this, as opposed to Trump is lying about this. As the three of us talk right now, you're beginning to see a change here. One early signal of that was during the videos we mentioned before about the murder in Minneapolis of Alex Preddy. The first headline they had on the Times was, videos appear to contradict Noem story. After about an hour, that changed to videos contradict Noem story, and sort of went on from there. And I think they have been just in the last day or two, as the three of us are talking, there is more information from the Epstein files that appears to be about Donald Trump. And they are covering this as a lead story, not critics say. And so I think at this moment, we're seeing a paper wrestling with that its normal reflexes do not apply anymore in the terrain we're operating in, and trying to change those reflexes. One other point here. If you think of the Times' coverage of any other topic, technology, what's happening in China, business, the arts, whatever, it's done in a realistic way. It is fair as opposed to being objective. The outlier has been its U.S. politics coverage, which has been too much, it's been whipped dog. And I think you are seeing that beginning to change. Let us hope the change continues in time.
Yeah, 10 years into the Trump phenomenon, I guess better late than never.
Yes.
One of the things I really enjoy about your writing is you write about aviation, and you often write about it in the detail of someone who flies an airplane and has to land on real airfields and thinks about what makes that system work safely and with the precision that it does. And it's an interesting example to me because aviation is real. It involves actual matter, and there are real consequences for departures from reality. It demands that you be intensely grounded in reality. And I think it's a quality about national politics where it is such a big country, and so many of the things that we talk about are so abstract. In the area of national politics, which dominates so much of the sort of pie chart of total news coverage that people consume, it is very easy to lie to people. right? Because their own experience of the world is so narrow. Whereas in many other areas, in the area of, is the school closed because of a snow day, right? Is the bridge going to be closed for repairs? What are the hours of the local library? All of those areas you can't really lie about them because people have much greater experience of them. And I just wonder a little bit about that gap, like a media that is where the overall pie chart of news consumption was much more oriented toward things that were closer to people that they actually knew, and would recognize the delta between reality and coverage. It seems to me like a strictly better place, right? I wonder how you think about that sort of gap between what is possible as in national versus local coverage.
That is really interesting. And your point about people having a reality check to match against the news coverage, that's one reason why local news is still comparatively trusted as national media are not, because people know all the examples you're talking about. Is the school open? Is the road plowed? Are all these things happening? And is the crime rate going up or down? So that's why there needs to be a reinvented economic base for local news. About the reality bias of aviation, one of the points I make maybe 1 zillion times, is that the reason aviation is so safe in the U.S., commercial aviation, is that it is so relentlessly honest. That when there is an investigation by the NTSB or whatever, they find out who screwed up. And part of the result, both the reason and result for that, is everybody in the aviation system feels accountable in some way. The mechanic and the controllers and the dispatchers and everybody else. And there's this question that goes through everybody's mind: how would it look in the NTSB report? If you skip this step, how is it going to look? Because there would be an NTSB report, and there isn't that kind of reality check in national politics. I will skip around and come back to say, if there were never again one of these "we talked to 5 voters" panels, the world would be better, because you learn zero from that. Yeah. You learn that people who support Trump support Trump. You learn people who don't support Trump don't support Trump. And it just teaches, I've never learned anything from any of those, and they should just spare the time. When we lived in China, something we learned was true was that anything you could say about China was true someplace. It was a success and it was a failure. It was rich, it was poor, it was cruel, it was kind. Same is true with political opinions. Everybody who's ever run for president since the Civil War and has lost, the loser has always gotten at least 38% of the vote. There's always tens of millions of people who support the loser. One last point, where you have the political world and the aviation world intersecting, is this crash over the Potomac.
Yeah.
Because instantly, Trump and his zero aviation reality show star, Sean Duffy, who now is in charge of transportation, they leaped to blame it on DEI, that this must have been some non-white controller. It must have been a female pilot, et cetera, et cetera. When the NTSB actually looked into it, the fault was mainly with a white male Army pilot in the helicopter who was skipping crucial steps. I mean, it was a dangerous situation, but that's where things finally broke down. And so that is why I paid attention to that investigation. The NTSB said, we have to know what actually happened here to avoid this. And the Trump reaction had been, oh, it must be these DEI hires. Let's get rid of them. So that's where the rubber met the road in a too literal sense.
To talk a little bit more about air travel, I want to make sure before we end here that we get a chance to talk about our towns. You and your wife, Deborah, traveled across the country for a couple of years in your, I know this because I looked it up, your Cirrus SR-22 single engine plane, visiting small towns or towns of different sizes all over the country and talking to the people who live there. And we were talking before about the difference between what you understand on a national level and what you understand on a local level. And I wonder if you could share what you came away with in the research for your book and then the HBO documentary, and also the inspiration for the organization that you've started now, the nonprofit called Our Towns. What was it that you saw in these small communities that gives you hope, that you think can be replicated, that makes it work in a way that we're not working on a national level right now, but maybe we can take some of those pieces and spread them farther than they're happening right now?
So this was after we'd come back from many years of living in China, where we spent most of our time on the road, going to little villages of 2 million people and seeing what life was like there. And since we had the tradition of flying to little places with our propeller plane and knowing how much more of the U.S. you could get to that way than by hub airports, we thought, let's see if we travel around South Dakota, how people are feeling about things going on there in upstate New York or in Alabama and Mississippi. And started this now, I guess, 12 or 13 years ago. And we would, for sort of half of our time over a 3 or 4 year period, go to towns that otherwise would be in the national news only when there was a tornado or a shooting or one of these panels on how Trump voters feel about Trump or something like that, but not as real places. And the main thing that emerged was how similar the feeling was in disparate parts of the country about what people wanted for their communities, and how much better people felt about the part of America where they were living than the part of America they read about or heard about in the news. Yeah. And for example, in the so-called Golden Triangle of Mississippi, of Columbus and West Point and Starkville, how a sort of manufacturing revolution was changing race relations there and educational opportunities for all kinds of people, and how in the Central Valley of California, places like Fresno were trying to reinvent themselves. And we had one really heartwarming experience where the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, former home of Bernie Sanders, which you all know well, and where the Republican Party is not a major factor, and the mayor of Greenville, South Carolina, where the Republican Party dominates both locally and nationally, those two mayors realized they were essentially running the same city. The same kind of ambitions, the same kind of tools, same relations with the universities and with bike trails and all the rest. And so we got them together. And so the point of our movie was that the U.S. looks much better up close than it does from a distance. And one of our theories about China is that China looks most formidable from a distance and most fragile up close. And the reverse being the case for the U.S., and trying to find some way to connect people around the country who were building libraries and reinvigorating their community colleges and finding ways to attract young people. And so we now have had this organization called the Our Towns Foundation. We have a website where we're chronicling these ongoing efforts, and we're trying to make people around the country know that they are not alone, and that their people like them are finding ways to solve problems, from libraries to sustainability to all the rest. So that's been an encouraging part of the national story for us.
It's great work, and the book is a great read. I think I think there's a lot Americans up close in your framing, but just in my experience are fundamentally better, kinder, more pragmatic people than our politics and our media reflects back to us. And so it's great that you are focusing on that with the foundation and with the book and the documentary. So folks should check that out. That's a good place to end it. James Fallows, we're so grateful for you taking the time. Folks can check your work out in many places, but among them, your Substack, Breaking the News, and at The Atlantic. And so we thank you for spending time with us.
John and Lisa, it's my pleasure and honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We would love to have the opportunity to speak with you again, because I think we skipped half the questions that we had for you today because we thought of so many more that we wanted to ask you once we started.
And I was
talking.
so long-winded, but that is
not
as long-winded as we've heard recently.
Oh, well, thank you again. Absolute pleasure. What an amazing gift to be able to spend time with James Fallows. I hope everyone enjoyed that as much as I know John and I did.
Yeah.
please share this episode. Share all the conversations that we're having. They're really important, and more people need to be joining in these types of conversations. So follow Signal Fire, like it, and you can find us everywhere at Get Noodle. And listen to the podcast or watch it wherever you get your podcasts, including on YouTube. And we will be back here next Wednesday with another episode. Thanks so much for joining us.